Wednesday nights are one of those, I wouldn't call it our casual night of the week, but it's the night of the week where we're not as formal as we are on Sunday morning, so we can relax and do a little more of a study type or something not as preachy. So that's what we're going to be doing for the next several weeks, is we're going to do something that I'm not aware we've done before, and that is do a course in church history. And when I mean church history, I'm talking about the period between the close of the book of Acts, which is the only New Testament. Well, Luke and Acts, the Gospels, and the book of Acts are really the history books of the New Testament. We have letters that are written during periods of church history, but no storyline that we can go by, at least from the Bible. So we've never done this before, and I'm going to attempt to do this tonight. Now, some of you, when I said history, you're a history buff, and so there's a part of you that kind of sat up and said, oh, awesome, this is going to be great. We're going to get to talk about history. So I don't have any explaining to do to you guys, because it's just history. Woohoo, I love history, right? Anybody in here love history? All right, well, I'm glad you're here. Now, not every hand went up, because there's some of you, when you heard the word history, it's like, oh, come on, I hated history in school. I won't ask you to raise your hand. I heard your moans, all right? So I know, I won't say I know who you are. I wouldn't want to embarrass anybody, but a cameraman who's running one of the cameras asked me if I was going to be doing a whole lot of moving around tonight. And I'm pretty sure that's because he was afraid he might fall asleep when he found out we were doing history. I wouldn't call his name, but he's sitting right back there in the balcony. If you want to turn around and look at him, I wouldn't want to make him uncomfortable. You should have gotten a handout when you came in the door. If you didn't and you would like one, I'm not going to be using a ton of slides tonight. I do have some, but I'm not going to be using the bulleted points. I figured it would be better if I could give it to you in the form of a timeline. So if you didn't get one of those and you would like one, raise your hand up real high. I have one up here in the front that I can see. I have this week's, what I intend to cover this week, and also some of what I intend to get into. Well, it's next week's timeline as well. That's not completely finished yet, but I went ahead and gave it to you in case we get that far in our study. If we zip through this pretty quickly, then we'll go ahead and start touching on what we're going to be covering next week. So let me speak to those of you who are not into history for just a second, though, that you're checking out. We're not going to worry about names and dates and times or anything else like that. I want you to just take it in as a story. Don't worry about what year it happened, except the kind of position in the story where it is in your mind. There's not going to be a test, so don't stress out over that stuff. I want you to just look and listen to the story of what happens to God's people from the close of the New Testament all the way through to the modern church today, or what's called the postmodern church. And I can think of, so when I'm trying to defend why we need to do a study in church history, I just started jotting down things that I consider to be a benefit of why we need to cover church history. This list isn't exhaustive, nor is it infallible, but let me tell you the 5 reasons I can think of that's important for us to know what happens in the history of the church. First of all, church history is our history. When we understand where we came from, we know better who we are, and we have a better idea of where we're going. So if we can look at what happened in our past, we get a little better perspective of where we are and what the next thing may be. So we're a little better prepared there. Second, we see the providence of God. Now, you can look back over your own personal history. You can look back over your own life, and looking back, it's much easier to spot God moving. How many of you can think of a time where you said, if it hadn't have been for the grace of God, I would be in a mess today? Or maybe you are in a mess today, and you said, if it wouldn't have been for the grace of God, I would be dead today, or something like that. All right, so that's just within the last several decades, possibly. In the 80 years, give or take a few years that we have on this earth, we can see God moving in our own life. I want to look at that from a 2,000-year lens, because we not only see God's fast-moving hand, we also see a slow-moving providential hand. And sometimes when we're tempted to think God isn't moving, He really is moving, and He's preparing the atmosphere for what He's doing. Third, we see the world through the lens of 2,000 years, and that helps us put our obsessions into perspective. What do I mean by put our obsessions into perspective? How many of the things that we make a big deal of every single day really aren't big deals at all? Right? The things that we get all bent out of shape about, or we get all worked up into a frenzy and worry about, when we look at that from a 2,000-year lens, how insignificant does that become? That doesn't take away your problem, but it does help us get perspective. Fourth, we see hope for the future. You might be tempted to think that the modern church today, the postmodern church today, is in a sad state of affairs and this is the end of the game. Well, I'll agree with you that it's in a sad state of affairs, but many times in history it has appeared to be the end of the game and it is not. I do believe we're living in the last times, but I don't at all believe God is finished with his people. And then finally, we're better equipped to spot the lures of the enemy. What do I mean by that? The deception that the enemy brings to us. I'm going to be using a lot, I heavily leaned on a book written by a man named Christopher Catherwood. It's called Church History, a crash course for the curious. And I felt like he did such a good job of just walking through the timeline. That's really what I'm using, I won't say as a text, but it was a major resource. And I'm going to quote him an awful lot. So here's the first quote that I have from Christopher Catherwood concerning the lures of the enemy. He says, most modern heresies, for example, are not new, but are recycled versions of errors long past, simply presenting themselves in an updated guise. So, as Solomon said in the Bible, there is nothing new under the sun. The same tricks the devil was using on the church 1,500 years ago are the same ones he brings around to us today. So if we know how he worked in the past, we get a little better picture of what he's doing in the present and in the future. All right, so how are we going to break this up? Because we're going to do this in two parts. I'm going to be doing the entire month of November, so that'll be 4 weeks before we hit our Thanksgiving break. We'll take a break for the holidays through Christmas, and we'll pick that up again in February. So November will be part 1. February will be part 2. There are 8 studies in all, and we're not going beyond that. I'm not going to do what we did in Luke, and it just seems like this is the study that never ends. All right, so we're going to do that in 8 weeks, and I quickly want to give you 2,000 years of church history in about 5 minutes, because I'm going to tell you what we're going to be studying as we look through the periods in church history. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Apostolic age. What do I mean by the Apostolic age? Well, it's the age where the apostles lived. So that's generally agreed somewhere around 30 A.D. until the last apostle dies, who is John, around 100 A.D. So we're going to be covering that tonight. And actually, we're going to go a little pre-New Testament there to lay a little bit of background. The next thing we're going to see is from the apostles to what's called the Council of Nicaea. So that's about a 225-year period from 100 to the year 325. Something very, very important happens that really changes. And the church goes from a persecuted church to an endorsed church. And it really changes the attitudes of Christians. It has political and economic impacts as well. Then we'll go from the Nicaea to the fall of the Roman Empire. Maybe I should say the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Don't worry if you don't know what all that's about, if you don't remember it from school. I didn't either. I had to go back and reread it again. So I'm going to walk us through that. And then we'll get into the medieval church and what's called scholasticism. That's sometimes referred to as the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. Some think it's called that because the church is really a controlling authority figure there. That's probably not the case. We often call it the Dark Ages because it really is localized economies and governments, and so we're not having lots of literature or art, things of that nature that are coming out of that time period. Not a whole lot of advancements made in society, so it's referred to as the Dark Ages. Then we get into the Reformation. This is where Protestants come into the picture, and we are on the Protestant leg of the Christian church. We're going to talk about how important that is, probably the most critical piece beyond the work of Jesus for where we are. Maybe I shouldn't give it that much commentary there. Then we go to what's called the Enlightenment Church. That's from 1648 to 1789. So now we're into the colonial period. And really the name of the game in that period is that humans shouldn't just rely or think about the afterlife. We have to also work on what's important in this life and try to relieve some of the suffering we're doing here. And then that brings us to the period of the modern church, 1789 to the 1970s. That's also called the age of revivalism. Some awakenings happen in that period. And then the current period that we're in is called the postmodern church, which is really a fancy way that people have come up with to say, we don't know what to call this particular age. Maybe 100 years from now, if the Lord should tarry, somebody will come up with a better name than that. But it really is a difficult to describe period. One of the common agreements, though, is that this is an experience-obsessed church. So if you'll listen, you'll hear some churches that have stopped calling their services, they actually begin calling them worship experiences because people millennial generation are very much into experiences, all right? So that's how we're going to break it down into the 8 different periods. First 4 we'll cover in November. The last 4 we're going to cover come February. So let me kind of jump right on into that. I don't want to rush through any of this, but I don't want to just continue to talk about nothing either. Let me quickly start out, since we're in an election year. In fact, this is the month when we're supposed to be voting for our president and other government officials. And I want to kind of pose a question to you that will be, I don't think I'm going to ask this every single week, but it'll kind of be an underlining tone underneath all of it, because we're going to be doing a lot of talking about governments and God's people. When we talk about history, we talk about who rises to power and how the church responds to who rises in power. So I think it's pretty relevant while we're talking about an election year that I ask the question, what is it, spiritually speaking? So spiritually speaking, what is it you hope happens as a result of this year's election? Spiritually speaking, within the church, spiritually speaking on a personal level. Now maybe you would say, well, I'm not counting on anything to take place in the spiritual realm because of this election. That's complicated. I'm not going to touch that in any way. I'm not even going to make the argument that we shouldn't pray. We absolutely should. That we shouldn't vote based on biblical principles. We absolutely should. We need godly leaders in the White House. We need godly leaders in Congress. We need godly leaders in state and local governments. But spiritually speaking, are we pinning our hopes on who gets in office? Because historically, the government has never been a good steward of righteousness. The government has never been a good steward of getting people to follow God. Somewhere down in your notes, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but somewhere down in your notes, there is a statistic from Christopher Catherwood that says in states, in countries where there is an official state church, participation in a church is 20 times less than in states where there is no official state church connection. That's an amazing statistic. So if we're talking about England, which I believe still has the official church as the Anglican Church, I could be wrong on that, but there's 20 times less participation from the citizens of England in churches than there is in the United States, where there is no official church-state link. Now, I know I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, because on the one hand, I'm saying, let's pray for our leaders, let's pray for godly leaders, and on the other hand, I say, let's not count on the government to do the job of the church. The president, the congressmen, the governors, the local leaders are a reflection of the American people. They're not the shapers of American culture. The people who are on the ballot this year are on the ballot because we put them there. Are they not? And so if we don't stand for their values as a culture, they don't end up being able to win the primaries and get their name on the ballot. That's the point I'm trying to make. If the church will be the church, and if God's people will be God's people, the government will follow the church and not the other way around. I think too many times the church is guilty of waiting on the government to move, and then they're going to make their move. We're going to really get into that next week. Now, a couple more disclaimers before I really jump into this story, and I know I'm talking so much, I'm just running out of time. I'm not a historian. Don't claim to be in any way a historian. I studied about a lot of this stuff years and years and years and years ago when I was in school, but it all leaked out of my head at some point over 30 or so years. I had to go back and re-research some of this stuff. So if you hear me say the wrong name or the wrong year or something of that nature, just pin it up to good old Ricky is not perfect. All right, the Bible is infallible. Ricky is not. So don't be too hard on me in that regard. I started this study a couple of weeks back with our college group who meets on Sunday night, and they were pretty quick to point out that I listed a Norse god with a list of Greek gods. Who knew? All right. So anyway, I'm not perfect in that regard. Don't claim to be a historian. Didn't even spend the night last night in the Holiday Inn Express. All right. Go easy on me. History and opinions. Let's talk about that. History is always subject to interpretation. We can tell the story from a particular viewpoint that gives someone the wrong impression or gives someone the impression that we want to give them. I'm going to do my very best not to do that, although that will happen. In some points, I'm purposefully going to stick that in there, but I'm going to try to stay as neutral as possible all the way through there. And then one last thing, anytime you talk about history, if one thing occurs, there may be 10 or 100 or 1,000 different outcomes because of that one event. So you realize if we're following a timeline, there are 10 or 100 different trails we could take as a result of that. I'm hoping to land in Protestant Church America, so I'm going to do my best to take us along the storyline that will get us to Protestant Church America. And you may say, well, what about the Orthodox Church or the Eastern Roman Empire, things like that? We're going to have to leave those alone because I only have 8 weeks, all right? So I know there's plenty more we could talk about. All right, quickly, let me jump in here, and if you look on your timeline, I actually want to go back to before the New Testament because there's a couple of things I need to point out that are important that occurred 300 years before Jesus is born, and there are two critical pieces there, probably more than that, but at least two critical pieces there. The first is in 336 BC, Alexander the Great completes his conquest of territories around the Mediterranean Sea and into the Indian subcontinent of Asia. So I got a map I've got here on the screen, if they will put that up. And just to give you a little, I don't know if you can see where my finger is there or not. I don't think I can do that with here, but you'll notice the big body of water to the left side of that screen is the Mediterranean Sea. Alexander the Great is Greek. He conquers this entire purple territory here. You don't need to know the names of the cities. In fact, I won't even get into the details. He does all this in about 10 years. That stretches almost all the way over into India, comes down around the Mediterranean Sea, so the area that we know as Israel today would be included in that territory, down into Egypt. Why do we care that happened? Because there's two things Alexander the Great brings into this conquered territory. It's called the spread of Hellenism. That's an academic way of saying spreading the Greek culture, all right? So when these territories are conquered, and they will be for many, many, many generations, Greek culture comes to the top. So we're talking about Greek gods, Greek way of living. We're also talking about a common Greek language. So even though this particular region may speak one language, they likely also speak Greek because you're conquered by the Greek emperor or whatever he may be called. I'm not positive about that. That's important, all right? So hold that particular one. Fast forward a couple of hundred years, we have the rise of the Romans, and that starts happening about 100 years before Jesus is born. Now, we've zoomed out a little bit. The big blue body of water in the center of that map is now the Mediterranean Sea. The Romans don't conquer all of Alexander the Great's territory, but everything around the Mediterranean Sea, Italy, up into Europe, the little island you can see at the top there says Britannia. All of that red area is what the Roman army has conquered. Now, those two things come together when Jesus is born, and they bring us two very critical pieces to what has to happen for the gospel to be spread throughout the world. The first is a common language, and that is the Greek language. Now, the Romans come in, the primary language of the Roman Empire is Latin. So between Greek and Latin, you can spread your word to this entire kingdom, probably beyond that, because if you do business with anybody, you need to do business with Rome. So likely the surrounding areas also speak either Greek or Latin. So we have a common language that we can use to spread a message. The Romans were very, very good at stable governments. So the Romans bring in stable government. We have a common language. Jesus is born. And it's the God-ordained perfect time for the Savior to come on the scene. For the news that Christ has come, redemption for mankind, can now spread quickly throughout this empire, and eventually to the rest of the world. So here's another quote from Christopher Catherwood. He says, "Surely these two extraordinary conjunctions, the size and stability of the Roman Empire and the multinational and equally geographically large use of Greek as a second language, cannot be just accidents. So helpful were they to the spreading of the gospel and making Christianity a global faith so early on, they must be seen as a part of the providence of God." 300 years before Jesus is born, God's been preparing the political and the cultural climate so that when Jesus is born, his ministry and his work and the redemptive power that he provided for us can quickly spread throughout that territory. And we're going to find out here in a little while, even in spite of Roman persecution, persecution actually serves to strengthen the faith. Now, in that vast area of territory, and I'll go back, I think I can. In this vast area here, how do you manage all this land? How do you manage all this territory? They didn't have cell phones. To my knowledge, at this point, there's not even a modern printing press that's been created. There's no Morse code. So if you're going to communicate from Constantinople and you need to get a message all the way over here to Spain, it's going to take a while. And the same thing happens if the territories around Spain should be attacked. You can't wait on the headquarters to respond. You've got to be able to respond locally. So we have junior rulers that are set up throughout the kingdom, and they're given wide authority over how they do that. But even beyond that, there has to be centralized loyalty. How are you going to do that? Many would-be rulers had tried for centuries before. Their kingdom gets so large it becomes unwieldy. They collapse in on themselves. So how are the Romans able to do it? They find ways to cause people to be loyal to who they are. So one of the things they require is that all worship the emperor as a god. He's deity. So at least we have the hearts of the people by telling them over the course of many generations that your emperor is also your God. You see this happening in North Korea today. You say, well, how could people do that? He's an ordinary man. North Koreans do it all the time. Other countries do that all the time. We had that happening in Japan back during World War II. So in the eyes of the people, they are indoctrinated that the emperor is God. Now, this is not a problem for the majority of the people here that are conquered. The reason it's not a problem is because almost every one of these people groups are what's called polytheistic. Poly meaning many, theistic meaning God, many gods. So you have the Greeks who have gods like Zeus and Olympia and Apollo and Hercules. You have the Romans who have Romulus and Remus and Jupiter and Juno and Minerva. You have the Hindu people, if there's some of them in that particular mix. They've got a couple thousand gods, maybe 1 million or more. I don't even remember from the study we did a while back, but it's not a problem to slip in one more, right? Now, there's one group that is not polytheistic. So in all of this conquered territory, there's one group that's not polytheistic. They're monotheistic. Mono meaning one, theistic meaning God, one God, and that is the Jews. So the Jews, this is going to be a problem. Now, I don't know all the details about how the Jews get an exemption, but that's basically what happens. Maybe Rome figures that it's not worth the fight. The Jews are ruling a territory that runs right along the Mediterranean Sea over there. It's really at a place we don't want to have any kind of riots start up over this whole emperor worship thing. So as long as this remains sort of localized, maybe they think this is not a major problem for them. So they, in effect, they kind of give Jews an exemption from worshiping the Romans as a god. Now, Romans see Christians as a sect of the Jews. Remember when we talked about this in one of the last times we studied, within the Jews you have the Pharisees, you have the Sadducees, you have the Zealots. In Rome's eyes, you also have the Christians. They believe in the one God, and that the disagreements between the Jews and the Christians are really no difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. It's just all localized religious squabbling that they're about. So the Christians initially sort of come under the umbrella of this exemption from the Roman Empire. But the Jews persecute the Christians, and the Christians continue to spread this message of the gospel until possibly, now we have to kind of fill in the blanks here, Christians become too unwieldy to be able to manage with this exemption. Rome finds out that Christians and Jews are really not the same thing, Christians don't hold any territories as far as an organized government goes. So there's no puppet king we need to set up here. So Rome, I suppose, takes the position that the best way to handle the Christians is to kill them. So they not only give authority to have that done, the Romans go in an active campaign to break up Christian circles. If that means we have to burn some of them, crucify some of them, whatever. It's all what's done in a day in the Roman Empire to keep the peace. So now we have the Christians who are persecuted, and I'm talking about cruelly persecuted. If you're in your home, in the land that you've grown up in all your life, quite possibly this is the home you inherited from your parents and they inherited from their parents, how dedicated are you to the message of Christ if a Roman soldier knocks on your door and tells you to break up your meeting, and that if you're found here meeting again under the name of Jesus Christ, your house will be burned to the ground and you will be killed? How serious are you about your belief system at this point? And we find out that as the Romans and as the Jews and as everybody else begins to persecute the Christians have to flee for their lives. So they begin meeting in underground caves. You'll hear the stories about them meeting in the catacombs. They meet in the tunnels underneath the city. They go into the country. They go into other cities where the Christians aren't so persecuted. And guess what they take with them everywhere they go is their zeal for Christ. So the persecution doesn't squash the message of the gospel. The persecution advances the message of the gospel. And it begins to be carried throughout the Roman Empire and even to the regions beyond the Roman Empire. And the more Rome tries to crack down on the Christians, the more convinced Christians are that this is truth. And the more resolved they are to tell other people about it. Now, I found, what's some of the persecution like? Well, I found if you go on Christianity.com, I'm sure it's on the internet and other places as well. So when we look at the New Testament, the history book that we're given, the last history book is the book of Acts. And really in the book of Acts, we talk about this spread of the gospel, Paul's missionary journeys and things of that nature. We don't really see what happens to all of the disciples. We don't really know. That's really kind of the close of the storyline. Now we see in some of the epistles and some of the other writings where Paul or Peter or someone else is writing to the persecuted church, this is what they're talking about. So what happened to the disciples? Well, we have to go from an infallible source, being the Bible. We have to go to some fallible sources. So we'll say church tradition. Josephus writes some, local tradition, other things that we can look to that we wouldn't deem as absolutely true, but there's enough to where these things are in agreement. This is likely what happens. And I'm just going to read through the whole list of all 12 disciples, what likely happens to them. Peter and Paul are both martyred in Rome about AD 66. It's during the persecution under Emperor Nero. It's said that Nero was one of the most cruel emperors in all of Rome. He was a little bit off in his head, they say, is a polite way to put it. He was crazy. And so for whatever reason, he starts a fire in Rome that quickly gets out of control. He does it, they say, for his amusement, and it quickly gets out of control. Well, once several people have lost everything they own, the people are very angry at Nero. Of course, he can't take the blame for himself. It's the Christians who did it. And so now we have more anger pointed at the Christians. Paul was beheaded. We do see that in the Bible. Peter was crucified upside down at his request, since he didn't feel he was worthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. Andrew went to the land of the man-eaters in what is now the Soviet Union. Tradition has Doubting Thomas preaching as far as East India, where the ancient Marthoma Christians revere him as their founder. They claim he died there when pierced through with the spears of 4 soldiers. Philip possibly had a powerful ministry in Carthage, in North Africa, and then in Asia Minor, where he converted the wife of a Roman proconsul, a senator. In retaliation, the proconsul had Philip arrested and cruelly put to death. Matthew, the tax collector and writer of a gospel, ministered in Persia and Ethiopia. Some of the oldest reports say he was not martyred, while others say he was stabbed to death in Ethiopia. Bartholomew had widespread ministry travels attributed to him by tradition. to India with Thomas, back to Armenia, and also Ethiopia and southern Arabia. There are various accounts of how he met his death as a martyr of the gospel. James, the son of Alphaeus, is one of at least three James referred to in the New Testament. There's some confusion as to which is which, but this James is reckoned to have ministered in Syria. The Jewish historian Josephus reports that he was stoned and then clubbed to death. Simon the Zealot, so the story goes, ministered in Persia and was killed after refusing to sacrifice to the sun god. Matthias was the apostle chosen to replace Judas. Tradition sends him to Syria with Andrew and to death by burning. John is the only one of the company generally thought to have died a natural death from old age. He was the leader of the church in the Ephesus area and is said to have taken care of Mary, the mother of Jesus, in his home. During Domitian's persecution in the middle 90s, he was exiled to the Isle of Patmos. There he's credited with writing the last book of the New Testament, the Revelation. An early Latin tradition has him escaping unhurt after being cast into boiling oil at Rome. So, tremendous persecution. And I want you to hold that thought there for just a minute, because I'm going to go on a sidetrack and point out one more thing that's on your timeline that's an important event, and that concerns the canonization of the Old Testament. What does it mean for the canonization of the Old Testament? Well, let's take apart the word. First of all, the word canon has two meanings. The first is a general law, rule, principle, or criterion by which something is judged. The second is a collection of sacred books accepted as genuine. So both apply when we talk about the canonization of the Old Testament. Really, it's a vetting process where we declare the books that are included in the Old Testament as divinely inspired by God and infallible. So that's one of the reasons, among others, that we say that the Bible is the infallible Word of God. Well, who's responsible for canonizing the Old Testament? Well, the Old Testament is really the story of the Jewish people, is it not? So some would say that the Old Testament was actually canonized, declared divinely inspired, way back 200 years before Jesus is born. Possibly they did, but for whatever reason, there's enough uncertainty about whether the Old Testament is truly considered sacred text or not, that they hold another council in AD 90. It's called the Synod of Jamnia. In AD 90, the Jewish religious leaders get together and they canonize the books that we now know as the Old Testament. Now, they had them grouped together, slightly different, but the same text, the same material that's in our Old Testament was what they confirmed way back in AD 90. Well, why is this important? Because even in the age of Jesus, the Jews, who are primarily responsible for rejecting Jesus as the Messiah, are the ones who vindicate him by canonizing the Old Testament scripture. All of the Old Testament points to the work of Jesus in the New Testament. It prophesies the place of his birth. It prophesies what he will do when he comes to this earth. Hundreds of prophecies, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, David, all of these prophecies in the Old Testament point to the person of Jesus Christ. I think it's a little comical here that even in a time of persecution, that the Jewish council confirms the Old Testament is divinely inspired, which further validates the person and the deity of Jesus Christ. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? So even in a time of persecution. So let's talk about this persecution for a little bit more, because this is where I really need to begin wrapping it up. And I want to make this personal. And I hope the question you're asking yourself is the same one that I'm asking myself as I'm going through this study. And that really is, how committed am I to the truth of the message of the gospel if it means that I personally or my family will suffer? That's a really tough question, is it not? We are comfort-oriented people. Look at me. I'm a comfort-oriented person. I like air conditioning and lazy boys. You take those two things from me, how committed I am. I won't say to Jesus, I hope I'm more committed to that, but what if suffering is on the line? Is that how committed I am? I'm not trying to be critical of the postmodern church, but if our air conditioning quits, there'll be a whole lot of people ain't come to church. Right? If the music's too loud, if it ain't the kind of music I like, I don't like the way that pastor says hallelujah, whatever your thing may be, I'll go find somewhere else, or I'm just going to stay at home. Or my kids have travel ball. Or I'm too tired because I stayed out on Saturday night. I'm not trying to beat anybody down. I just want to draw a comparison between the dedication of the persecuted church and the dedication of the non-persecuted church. Because that's really what we're going to get into next week. How committed are we really to the truth of the gospel? In light of all of that, this persecution that's going to continue another 200 years past the end of the apostolic age, I want to go back and kind of close this out by reading you some of the words of Jesus, some of the words of Paul, as he writes to these people who are fleeing for their lives. Here's what Jesus says in Luke 6:22 through 23. You've heard this before, but I want you to hear this from the perspective of somebody who's running in the middle of the night to keep their family from being murdered. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you and insult you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, because great is your reward in heaven, for that's how their ancestors treated the prophet. Does that bring you comfort while you're on the trail? Well, sure it does. Jesus told them this would happen. Paul writes this to the Romans: Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. Knowing all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. He writes to the Philippians, and the theme of that book is be joyful. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. And let me give you one more, 2 Corinthians. So Paul writing again. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. When I am weak, then I am strong. That's not American culture, is it? American culture is when I'm rich, I am strong. When I am fit, I am strong. When I am comfortable, I am strong. Paul says, no, none of that's true. When I'm weak, I am strong. 300 years of persecution is what we're eventually going to see. To put that in perspective, if we rewind from 2016, take 300 years off, we're back into the 1700s. 1716 would be 300 years from this year, backwards. Talking about the colonial days in America. That's how long the persecution exists in the church. So we're talking about people who were born into, lived, and died having known nothing different. And yet, the truth of the gospel not only prevails, it thrives. This persecution is fuel in the fire to people who never saw Christ in many cases. So the question is, the one I started in the beginning, we look to our government to churn out dedicated, God-fearing, moral people. The moral base in America will never be created by the Democrats or the Republicans. The moral base in America is the Christian people. And when we get serious about what we truly do believe, that's when I believe revival comes to America. Yeah, but you know what I'm facing at work? I can guarantee you whatever you may face at work is nothing compared to what these people faced. And I know I can stand up here in an air-conditioned building with a microphone among people who hopefully like me, if not love me. Most of you anyway. Really easy for me to talk about, what if you're hostile toward me, like was happening to Paul when he preached? The mobs would just come at him. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? It's really where I want to leave you hanging. Because we're going to pick it up next week where in 3:12 or somewhere thereabout, all that changes. That's a good thing, right? Persecution ends. It's a good thing, right? Probably not. Good in some ways, not so much in others.